First Meetings by Miss Winifred Quayle, Chapter 2, Rhodey. Rhodey has been unable to get on to Tony, so he called Pepper, thinking Tony had gotten completely wrapped up in a project in the lab, as he so often did. Instead, Pepper had delightedly informed him that Tony had gone out to pick up his mentee/intern from a party. Rhodey didn't come into Manhattan much these days, preferring to stay at the compound. Although he coped pretty well with the braces Tony had made for him, and continued to get steadier and stronger every day, Rhodey couldn't help but feel rather self-conscious in large crowds of people. He made a special visit this time, though, specifically to see his best friend. He'd gone home to Philadelphia to spend Christmas and New Year's with his mother and family, and decided to trespass upon Tony and Pepper's hospitality for a few days, while passing through on his way back to the compound. He could pretend it was because he missed his friends, which wasn't a lie, but more than anything, Rhodey was hoping for a chance to officially meet Peter Parker. Tony had mentioned nonchalantly that he was looking out for the young superhero, but it was Pepper who had spilled the full beans. He and Tony have bonded. Shit, my family's still home. She informed him one night in early December when Rhodey had called her. He had been unable to get on to Tony, so he had called Pepper, thinking Tony had gotten completely wrapped up in a project in the lab, as he so often did. Instead, Pepper had delightedly informed him that Tony had gone out to pick up his mentee/intern from a party. Rhodey held the phone out for a moment, rubbing his ear as low to clear it. "I'm sorry, he's doing what?" Pepper laughed knowingly. One of Peter's friends on the decathlon team is hosting a little get-together so they could study for the next meet. One of Peter's friends on the decathlon team is hosting a little get-together so they could study for the next meet. It's been held at his mother's house, who lives out on Long Island, she explained. May was going to pick up Peter afterwards, but she'd gotten stuck at work, so she asked Tony to pick Peter up instead. And Tony did it himself, instead of sending Happy or an Uber or something? Rhodey demanded incredulously. Yep. Rhodey could practically hear Pepper grinning over the phone. You have to see Tony with Peter Rhodes. It's something else. In what way? Pepper paused, thoughtfully. I've just never seen Tony so determined to do right by someone, she said. Not even when he first got back from Afghanistan. He's trying so hard to help Peter however he can. Like picking him up from a party in Long Island, Rhodey asked. Pepper chuckled. Yeah. Rhodey adjusted his position in his chair, grimacing slightly as he stretched out his legs. And the kid. Peter adores Tony, Pepper replied immediately. It's really sweet, but he still seems afraid of bugging Tony too much. Tony's working on squashing that out of him. Rhodey snorted. I have no doubt he'll manage that, he said dryly. He'd been hoping to get to Manhattan to see this for himself before Christmas, but hadn't managed it in the end. So passing by after Christmas seemed like a good enough alternative. The day after he unceremoniously set himself up in Pepper and Tony's guest room, Pepper had a conference call scheduled with someone in New Zealand, which left Tony and Rhodey in their own devices for dinner and entertainment, thanks to the considerable time differences. What was that Italian place in Queens we went to that one time? Rhodey mused aloud as they discussed their dinner options. Tony raised an eyebrow at him. You're kidding me, right, platypus? Rhodey waved a dismissive hand. You know the one. We ate there with when my mom came up for Christmas shopping the first year you and Pepper were here with the duck meatballs? Tony's face cleared. Oh, yeah? Let's eat there, Rhodey suggested. Tony considered that for a moment and then agreed. Mind if we make a detour on the way, though? Rhodey shrugged. Sure. Tony didn't elaborate on what this detour was, and Rhodey didn't really ask, as long as they got to eat. He wasn't hugely concerned. He did note the wrapped package Tony tossed onto the backseat of the Audi as they got into the car, but he reasoned dropping off a package wasn't going to take terribly long or ruin their night. But when Tony finally pulled up outside an apartment block in Queens and cut the engine, Rhodey shot a questioning glance between his best friend and the building. You coming? Rhodey followed immediately, falling into step behind Tony as he grabbed the package from the backseat and headed inside without hesitation. It embarrassingly was only when Tony came to a halt and knocked on an apartment door that Rhodey recalled it being mentioned that Peter Parker lives in Queens. A few moments later, and the door was opened by a teenage boy that Rhodey recognized as Peter from a few photos Pepper had sent him of Tony and the boy working in the lab together over the past 2 months since Pepper had met the kid. But he would have immediately identified him as such anyway by the way Peter's whole face lit up as he realized who was standing in the hall before him. Hey, Mr. Stark. Hi, kid, Tony replied warmly. Not interrupting any exciting Friday night plans, are we? He was teasing, but Peter shook his head, making a face. Homework, he said glumly, even as he stepped back slightly to allow Tony entry into the apartment. That may be the most depressing thing I've ever heard, Underoos, Tony said dryly, stepping inside. Peter chuckled, his cheeks flushing faintly. It's fine, it's not like I could go out anyway, even if my teachers didn't all decide we had nothing to do the first weekend of semester than study. Speaking of which, Tony said, and tossed the kid the parcel in his hands. Peter caught it easily, not even needing to open it before gratitude washed over his face. Fully repaired now. I can't believe this is a thing I need to do to you, but in future, let's not throw a multi-million-dollar crime-fighting suit to the lions, yeah? Rhodey blinked. He really hoped that was a metaphor, or he needed to pay closer attention to Tony's stories when they talked. Peter just rolled his eyes at Tony, looking either annoyed or amused. Rhodey couldn't tell. You say that like I didn't on purpose, he complained, but thanks, Mr. Stark. How's Lenny? Tony asked, oddly gravely. It's fine, Peter reassured him. Totally healed. It couldn't even get me out of gym class yesterday, he complained, and Tony snorted. I'd sympathize, if not for the mild heart attack I'm still recovering from, Tony said dryly. Peter just rolled his eyes again, although he did appear faintly chagrined this time. Totally fed up with not understanding the conversation or being acknowledged, Rhodey took the opportunity to clear his throat and draw attention to himself. Tony and Peter both looked towards him, Peter's eyes immediately widening. Oh, right, you're here, Tony said dismissively, and Rhodey glared at him pointedly. Rhodey, Peter, Rhodey, he added, gesturing lazily between the two. Hi, Peter. Rhodey addressed him. Hi, Peter replied tentatively. And Tony's gaze turned gentle as it returned to the kid, which made Rhodey smile often in turn. I mean, you've technically met before, Tony reminded them. That does not count, Tony, Rhodey retorted immediately. Tony shrugged and clasped Peter on the shoulder. All right, Spiderling, let me check your knee quickly and we'll get out of your hair. It's really fine, Mr. Stark, Peter protested. And I'd be more inclined to take your word on that if I hadn't met you, Parker, Tony said teasingly. Peter reddened faintly, but didn't argue further. He just sighed dejectedly and led the way further into the apartment and over to the couch. The coffee table was covered with textbooks and notebooks, and Tony let out a low whistle. Jesus, you weren't kidding about all the homework, were you? Peter shook his head, grimacing towards the books. No. Most of it's due Monday. I don't think I'll get to patrol it all weekend. Something passed over his face that Rhodey couldn't make out. Tony, however, just perched himself on the corner of the coffee table and squeezed Peter's arm lightly. Queens will cope for the weekend, kiddo, he said gently. Rhodey barely stopped himself from raising an eyebrow in surprise, whether at Tony's tone or words. He wasn't sure. Either way, he was glad Tony had gone back to ignoring him and couldn't see his face. Rhodey barely stopped himself from raising an eyebrow in surprise, whether at Tony's tone or words. He wasn't sure. Either way, he was glad Tony had gone back to ignoring him and couldn't see his face. School comes first, you know this, and I'm not just saying it in case your aunt is listening in. Peter scoffed. Where is May, anyway? Tony asked, glancing around. Hot date. Peter made a face. No. She had to stay back at work. There was some kind of crisis. She won't be home until midnight if she's lucky, and she's working a double shift this weekend too. And what are you going to do? Peter gestured rather helplessly at the spread of books on the coffee table. I've got a mountain of chemistry and physics homework and a calculus test to study for, which I hate. And we've got a research report to do for global history before Monday, too. His voice seemed slightly higher than before to Rhodey's ears by the end of his speech, and obviously to Tony's ears, too. Well, take a deep breath, Pete, he instructed, leaning forward to place a grounding hand on Peter's arm. It's fine. You've just... What is that? Both Peter and Rhodey turned their gaze to a bowl on the end of the table couch that had caught Tony's attention. Dinner. Who the fuck is that? Dinner, Peter answered. The message of duh was heavily implied. Tony stretched forward and grabbed the bowl, peering inside before staring back at Peter. It's mashed potato. Peter blinked. Yeah? Let me rephrase that. It's just mashed potato. Girl, stop sending me videos. I can't. Peter blinked again. It's a vegetable, he said defensively. That doesn't make it dinner. Tony actually scolded him, and Rhodey couldn't help but snort, remembering some of the feeble dinners he'd seen Tony eat over the years, especially at MIT or when he was neck-deep in a project in lab. His snort drew Tony's attention, who didn't require Rhodey to elaborate on the reason behind his reaction. They'd been friends for too long for that. You shush, platypus. I'm imparting wisdom here. Tony turned back to Peter, who looked rather dejected. Kid, you know you need to eat more than this for your metabolism. There's no way in hell May would let you get away with eating this if she was here. Peter winced slightly. I know, he admitted. I just wasn't hungry. I've got all this work to do, and I'm really stressed about the stupid calculus test. Ned was going to come over and study on Sunday, but he can't now because his grandparents surprised them with a visit, and they live in Miami, so he never gets to see them. Rhodey watched as Tony gave a short nod in response, then took off his coat and drew out his phone as he dumped the coat on the couch. All right, what do you feel like? Pizza, Italian, Chinese? Peter's mouth dropped slightly as he gaped at Tony. You know what? Let's do snake. It's good brain food. Tony fiddled with the phone for a moment and then held it out to Peter, who just stared at it hesitantly. Underoos, if you think I'm going to leave you here alone to eat a sad, gross bowl of mashed potato and not think I won't be telling your aunt that... And don't think I won't be telling your aunt about that, FYI. And spiral yourself into a mental breakdown on a Friday night. You've got another thing coming, Tony said bluntly. You've got two MIT grads here at your disposal. I think we can handle some high school calculus. Peter's gaze looked rather watery to Rhodey's eyes. Aren't you busy? He asked in a small voice. With what? Tony retorted. Pepper's talking to New Zealand. Rhodey and I were just gonna get dinner, which we can still do here with you. Peter didn't look convinced, and Tony waved a hand in Rhodey's direction. I've spent 30 years with Rhodes' kid. Quite frankly, I'm tired of looking at his face. Rhodey rolled his eyes. Love you too, Tones, he retorted. Order or I'll order for you, faintly, he threatened. And Peter at last relented. Tony waved his hand, his phone, it amused Rhodey to no end, watching the way Tony watched Peter place his order, nodding approvingly before he tossed the phone to Rhodey. Order yourself dinner, Rhodes, and sit down, will you? You're making the place look untidy. Rhodey rolled his eyes again, but did so, shedding his own coat and scarf before easing himself into an armchair, while he added his own meal to the order and finalized it, only somewhat mourning the loss of the promised duck meatballs. Tony finally got around to inspecting Peter's knee for himself. He appeared to be satisfied with whatever he found. When did May find out she'd be late? He heard him ask Peter quietly. Only a few hours ago, Peter replied. It was a last-minute thing. You should have texted, Tony said, his tone lightly scolding. You could have come over instead of being here alone. Peter's cheeks reddened, and his eyes were downcast. I wouldn't want to. Tony dropped Peter's leg and leaned forward, tapping Peter under the chin with his finger to make the kid lift his eyes. For the millionth time, Parker, you do not bug me, he said sternly. Peter's face grew redder, and he nodded. But Rhodey could tell Tony wasn't convinced. Peter. Tony's voice was softer now, and Peter's eyes widened like Tony had shouted at him. Kid, I spent a lot of nights and ate a lot of meals alone growing up. It sucks, he said bluntly. So, when Pepper and I say you're welcome at ours any time, we mean it. And if I have to kidnap you every time May is working until you get that through your thick skull, I will. Understood? Peter's eyes were bright as he nodded again. Tony ruffled Peter's hair lightly and then shooed him over so that he could sit beside him on the couch. All right, bud, show me the homework while we wait for the food. As Peter reached down to a textbook from the table, Rhodey sank back against the armchair, pulling out his phone and composing a text to Pepper. Rhodey. So we detoured on our way to dinner so Tony could deliver Peter's suit to him, and now somehow we're ordering in dinner and helping the kid with his homework. She replied fairly quickly, considering that she was in a meeting. Pepper, you've met Peter? Damn, I wanted to be there. And dinner now. It's after 8. Rhodey, his aunt got stuck at work, apparently. Peter made himself a bowl of mashed potatoes for dinner, and Tony shut that down quick. I don't think he wants to leave the kid. He's stressing over a lot of homework from the sound of things. Pepper, poor kid. So, Rhodey didn't need to ask her what she meant by that. He paused before typing his response, considering his own words carefully, shooting a glance towards Peter and Tony. Finally, he simply responded, Rhodey, you were right. Pepper sent back a string of emojis in response. Rhodey wasn't quite sure what they all meant, but he got the gist. Glen Coco. It was almost an hour before the food arrived, but Tony used that time to help Peter sort through his homework while they waited. Rhodey would be lying if he said it didn't warm his heart to watch Tony help Peter with his homework. Even as they ate, they worked quietly, and Peter looked noticeably calmer by the time Tony declared they were putting the books aside for now and watching something. "You got all weekend, bud. Don't overload yourself," he said wisely. Rhodey bit back another comment, pointing out how Tony's comments were rather contradicted his own behavior. When Tony settled back against the couch and asked Peter, what are we watching, kid?" Rhodey felt his heart clench with warmth to see Peter's face brighten as he realized Tony had no intention of leaving anytime soon. "You still haven't watched John Mulaney, which is like sacrilege, Mr. Stark," he said, and Tony rolled his eyes. A bit rich coming from a kid who didn't get my Three Musketeers reference last week, but sure. It was during the movie they'd put on after watching the stand-up special that Tony's sudden, quiet, sharp inhale of breath caught Rhodey's attention. He jerked his gaze away from the television to see Peter fast asleep against Tony's shoulder. Rhodey grinned broadly, pulling out his phone and taking a photo. "Okay, that's cute." Tony glared at him. "Shut up," he said quietly, then paused. "Hand me that throw blanket, would ya?" Rhodey did so, still grinning. It was 12:30 when the apartment door opened and Rhodey turned to see a woman around their age enter the room, her face worn with exhaustion, and she didn't look at all surprised to see Tony and Rhodey there. "Hey," Tony greeted her softly, a sheepish expression crossing his face. "So, funny story." The woman smiled. "Pepper texted me earlier." She cut him off, approaching them. Her face softened as she looked at the sight of Peter sleeping soundly on Tony's side. "Thank you, Tony. You didn't need to do that." "He was stress-eating a bowl of mashed potatoes, May," Tony said in a pained voice, and she rolled her eyes. "God, he's an idiot sometimes," she said with a sigh. "How can someone so smart be so dumb?" Rhodey snorted. "I've been asking that for 30 years. Tony glared at him again. Just for that, I'm not going to introduce you," he retorted. Rhodey ignored him and offered a hand towards the woman. "James Rode. You can call me Rhodey." "May Parker," the woman replied, shaking his hand with a smile. "I didn't want to wake him," Tony said apologetically when May turned her gaze back to her nephew. "Or just leave him in case he woke up before you got home. I thought—" "Tony, it's fine," May reassured him, cutting him off with a smile. "Breathe, please." Tony did relax a little at that. "Pete said you were working a double this weekend?" May nodded. I said if it was okay with you, I'll steal him for the weekend. Get him through all the homework and studying?" Tony asked awkwardly. May did look a little surprised at that. "Are you sure? It's physics and calculus. I think I can handle it." Tony shrugged, the shoulder that wasn't serving as Peter's pillow. "I thought it might be better than him stressing himself out alone." Tony's tone was rather tentative, and Rhodey couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his friend sound so unsure of himself. May smiled like she knew something Tony didn't, and Rhodey had an inkling what that was, despite having only spent a few hours with Peter and Tony together. "Thanks, Tony. If you don't mind, that would help a lot," she admitted. "I'm never thrilled about him being home alone so much." Then she nodded towards him. "Pretty sound sleeper. You can probably move him without waking him." "That'll just a toot." Tony glanced down at Peter before carefully shifting Peter off of him, so that he could get up off the couch. Peter did stir, though, and Tony winced faintly at the eyes flickering open. "Hey, kid," he said quietly. "May's home." Peter's sleepy gaze found his aunt. "Oh, hi." May chuckled. "Hi, sweets. Go to bed, huh?" Peter nodded, rubbing his eyes blearily and stumbling to his feet. Tony steadied him by the elbow. "I'll pick you up at 10, all right?" he said to him. Peter nodded, although it didn't look like he was really comprehending anything being said. And then he suddenly leaned into Tony, wrapping his arms around Tony's ribs. "Thanks, Mr. Stark," he mumbled. Tony froze, and then slowly wrapped his arms around Peter, hugging him almost gingerly. "Any time, bud," he said quietly. May was smirking at Tony as she nudged Peter towards his bedroom. "God, I wish I had a camera," she said. She said, saying exactly what Rhodey had been thinking. Tony narrowed his eyes at her. "Good night, May." "Good night, Tony," she mimicked his tone, grinning. "Nice to meet you, Rhodey." "You too," Rhodey offered, grinning broadly himself. Tony stared at them both for a moment and then grabbed his coat. "I hate you both," he muttered. "Peter's the only one nice one here." May laughed quietly as Rhodey followed Tony towards the door. Rhodey couldn't stop grinning the whole way down to the car, which Tony pointedly ignored. Pepper had waited up for them to return, and Tony greeted her with a quick kiss and the announcement Peter would be staying with them for the weekend, while May worked so that Tony could help him with his homework. Pepper barely reacted. "Okay," she agreed. "I'm going to grab a shower and then head to bed," Tony continued nonchalantly, and left the room. Once he'd gone, Pepper looked to Rhodey with a raised eyebrow. He grinned at her. "Peter hugged him," he said delightedly. Pepper broke into an ecstatic grin. "Tell me everything," she instructed. Rhodey eagerly obeyed. That is the end of this chapter.